maybe I'm doing something. No, which one should I use? You're looking for Zoom. Oh, that one. Oh, you know. Oh, yeah, so, both WebEx and Zoom.
Okay, το WebEx δεν κάνουμε podcast εκεί.
So this is the Zoom. I give you. Oh, this one.
Ναι.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Αυτό δεν δουλεύει, Παντελή, ναι. But it doesn't change over there.
Ωραίες. Can you try now?
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Okay. That gave us the chance to take a short break, which I think was good. So, yeah, I want to talk to you about large graphs, basically, and network science. But what is interesting is that the last few years, this field has been merging more and more with machine learning. So it's kind of hard to distinguish these two things these days. So I want to talk a little bit about what is network science, give you some examples, some basics, and then spend most of the time actually talking about network models. And we will see how these models started from being very simple models with just a few parameters. And more recently, we have been moving towards machine learning models with graph neural networks and so on. So that's what I want to focus on. The topic of network science has been around, I think, for 25 years or so. These are some very introductory textbooks. By the way, if you, at the end of this talk, my goal is, of course, to not like teach you network science in just 1 hour, but my goal is to increase your appetite, right, for network science. And if at the end of the talk you feel like this is an exciting topic, then we can talk, more about other resources that are available. So then there are much more, specific books about specific types of networks, such as economic networks or, biological networks. And there are also more advanced books in terms of the underlying math and the underlying theory. We will talk a little bit about that also. So in terms of practical applications, I hope you agree with me that graphs and networks are everywhere. You can think about graphs essentially anytime you have a set of entities that have relations, bilateral relations between those entities, right? So you can model transportation networks with graphs where the nodes are junctions and the edges are the highways between those junctions, and those networks may be weighted in the sense that the different roads may have different width or capacity. You can think about transportation networks that are like airline networks. You can think about social networks and how things like viruses, for instance, may be spreading over a social network. I think there is an animation here, if I remember well, where it's just a simulation showing how a virus that started from Mexico got spread all over the world. And the main point of the simulation was that if you know the airline connections between different cities, if you just know basically how many planes go from one airport to another, then you can predict very accurately how this virus actually spread over time. So you don't really need to know a lot about the underlying biology as far as you know the underlying way that people move. This is a graph that when I teach this class at Georgia Tech, it always gets the attention of students because it has to do with, romantic relations, whatever that means. So this is a social network of high school students. And I think the question that they asked them was, who did you date over the last 6 months? And blue is boys, pink is girls, and you get this type of networks. And of course, they are interesting to analyze from various perspectives, including also how potential diseases would spread in a high school environment or from the social aspect. Of course, social media like Twitter and so on have been analyzed using network analysis. In this case, the graph is directed because typically, you follow somebody. It's not necessary that they follow you back. So the edges are directed. You can have, of course, bidirectional edges. I should say that in many cases, we're interested in clusters of connectivity or communities. Excuse me. So communities, you can think of it as groups of nodes in which the connectivity between them is much denser than the overall connectivity in the graph. So this is an example of a study that was done with dolphins. People were following dolphins in terms of how they move, and dolphins are very, very social animals, so they spend a lot of time with other dolphins. And they were kind of analyzing the resulting social network of dolphins and found that there exist actually clusters, the red cluster, the blue cluster. There are some green dolphins. They're not really green, right? That are actually between the two clusters. And this notion, by the way, of clusters, right, or communities in the graphs, it's a very common concept. We will see it again later in the presentation. For some reason, you cannot see the title of any slide. Let me see if I can get rid of this. Oh, even if I get rid of it, the title is still not visible. Okay. So anyway, the title is basically saying that this is an example of a dynamic network, a network that changes over time. It basically represents, the nodes represent countries, and the edges represent major trade between those countries. And basically, if you could see the labels, I have no idea what's happening here. Adeli, help. You know that song that says, help, I need somebody. Anyway, now it's not moving at all. I don't know. I cannot. What I see here is different than what I see there.
No, that's so.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, we're making good progress.
Should be better now.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so I was talking about dynamic networks, networks that change over time. And in this case, for instance, you can see how if you analyze the connectivity, of course, it's also clear visual in this case, but if you analyze the connectivity, you can see that China, which was a very peripheral country back in the 90s, became basically the central hub in this network of trade worldwide. So a lot of the networks that we analyze in this field are actually dynamic in nature, which makes it much more interesting. Of course, there are applications in biology. For instance, proteins can interact with each other, they can bind to each other, and that creates networks of protein-protein interactions. And then biologists typically want to know if you have all of these protein interactions for a certain organism, which proteins participate in certain functions, for example, in the metabolism function or in signal transduction. And then depending on the function of the protein, you can also basically ask what happens if something is wrong in some sense with that protein, if there is a mutation in the corresponding gene. And of course, again, you can have clusters here, as you can easily see, clusters in terms of the connectivity between these proteins. And what happens most of the time is that each of these clusters is associated with a certain biological function, right? So the orange, for example, is RNA metabolism and so on. In brain networks, you can also think about them as graphs, a graph between neurons, right? Again, directed because it goes from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic neuron. For certain organisms, we have the actual complete brain where we know all the neurons and all the synapses, and we can simulate this thing. We can try to figure out how this organism actually thinks based on its network of neurons. And of course, for larger brains like our brain, we cannot really see every neuron, but we can use technologies such as MRI, either functional MRI or diffusion MRI, structural MRI. There are different modalities, right? Where you can create networks that connect different regions of the brain, not individual neurons, but say, you can ask how the amygdala, connects to the hippocampus, or how strong is that connection. And again, that's very useful when you are both trying to understand how the brain works, but also in thinking about certain diseases. Like, for example, one work that we were doing back at Georgia Tech in collaboration with neurologists that was related to depression. The question was, if you do stimulation, like something called deep brain stimulation, where you go to some of these connections and essentially you stimulate them with electrodes, right? Which specific points should you stimulate so that you alleviate the symptoms of depression? So there are actual real applications of network analysis, network science. So the question that emerges in all of these studies is, there is a complex system. Somehow you model it with a graph, which is, of course, an abstraction. And then you ask, how do the structural properties of that graph, the topology of that graph, right? How do they affect the dynamics and the evolution of the corresponding system, right? So if I know something about the topology of that graph, can I make some predictions about the underlying, say, biological system or technological systems and so on. And a lot of what happens in this area over time, at least, it started, from people that were doing graph theory. There were a lot of physicists in the early days, people that came from statistical mechanics, nonlinear dynamics. And at least in my biased perspective, I'm saying biased because I'm a computer scientist, the field now is moving more and more towards machine learning and data science, applied data science. And so it gradually becomes a much more computational field. Okay, so let's start with just to remind you things that I'm sure you already know from your undergrad. So graphs, right? We have nodes, we have edges. The notion of a degree, the degree of a node is how many connections it has. We can talk about the density of a graph, which is the fraction of all possible edges that actually exist. We can represent graphs with matrices. The adjacency matrix, as you know, it represents if a connection exists with a 1 between a corresponding pair of nodes. If you can represent graphs with matrices, then you can use all the magic of linear algebra, right? And you can compute, for example, different spectral properties of these graphs. You can work with the adjacency matrix, and you can prove things like that the largest eigenvalue of the matrix is bounded above by the maximum degree in the graph. And there are many such matrices. It's not only the adjacency matrix. You can work with the so-called Laplacian matrix, and other matrices exist in the literature. The important thing that I want you to know here is that a lot of the underlying math that happens in network science is actually, it's actually based on linear algebra. And statistics, because a lot of, many times we think about these graphs in a probabilistic framework where the connectivity is not, deterministic. It's basically based on an underlying random, it's based on randomness. So in that case, we can, for instance, talk about the probability that a node has a degree k, the probability that you have k connections. And then if you have such probability distributions about the connectivity, you can define things like the average degree, which is shown as k bar, the second moment of the degree distribution, the variance of the degree distribution, and so on. Now, of course, for larger graphs, we would like to show the distribution in a more compact way. So instead of visualizing the graph, every single node, every single edge, we may only visualize the probability distribution for the number of connections, or for the probability that a certain node has a degree that is greater than a certain number k, right? Now, just to show you that things can get interesting and maybe even counterintuitive, I will now try to convince you that on average, in a statistical sense, your friends have more friends than you. Okay, this is kind of how I will try to get your attention this morning. So let's think about a graph that, again, is constructed completely randomly. So imagine that we have this n lowercase n people, and the total number of edges is m. And these edges have been thrown into the graph completely randomly. There are no correlations that, if you have a certain number of friends, you connect to people with a certain number of friends either. So the connections are completely random. And so in this graph, of course, you can calculate the average number of connections as k bar, which is actually given by 2m, and is the number of edges, right, over n. So that's the average degree. If I ask you on the average, how many friends do you have? You should tell me the answer k bar, right? That's the average. But then I can ask you another question. I can ask you, on the average, how many friends does your neighbor has, right? So let's think about this in two steps. First of all, you have to ask, what's the probability that one of my neighbors has a degree k, right? A specific degree, a given degree k. What's the probability that your neighbor will have that degree? So again, n is the number of nodes, p sub k is the probability that the node has that degree. So this is essentially the expected number of nodes of degree k. And here, basically, we have the fraction, right, of the stubs, the endpoints, essentially, of edges that belong to nodes of degree k. So in that case, we can basically calculate this probability, right? The probability that we will connect to a node of degree k. So this is the formula that we end up with. And then I can ask, what is the average degree of your neighbor, right? So you know this by the expectation over here. Just based on expectation, right? I will consider all possible degrees. The degree times the probability that the node has that degree, right? So Q of k is this quantity over here. So I'm doing a little bit of very innocent algebra. I'm not sitting here, trust me, right? You see what the algebra does, and you end up with this nice little formula, right? What is the formula saying? That on the average, the degree of your neighbor is not k bar, which is the average degree in the network. It's k bar plus a positive quantity, which has to do with the variance of the degree distribution, with how, heterogeneous the degree distribution is. So because this is positive, essentially what this formula says is that on the average, your neighbor will have a higher degree than the average degree in the network. Okay, this is called the friendship paradox. Just to make the environment here a little bit more lively, does anybody have some intuitive understanding of why this happens? Why essentially the math gives us this result, which at first it may seem a little bit counterintuitive. Okay, so think about I pick a node randomly and I pick randomly one of that node's neighbors, right? And essentially I'm showing that that neighbor on the average is expected to have a larger degree than the average degree in the network. Yeah, Panayota? Right. I think you're saying the right thing, right? So you're not picking randomly nodes, you're picking randomly edges, right? And the edges, of course, if you have nodes with more edges, right, it's more likely that the edge that you picked will actually get you to a node with higher degree, right? It's the difference between selecting nodes randomly versus selecting edges randomly. I'm selecting essentially edges randomly here, and then I'm asking for this edge that I picked, what is the degree of that node, right? So nodes with larger degree are more likely essentially to be sampled that way because I'm sampling edges, right? Okay, so I show this just to kind of make you excited about this topic. Now let's go back to very basic models. When back in the actually 40s or 50s, when people were thinking about random graphs for the first time, including mathematicians like Erdos and Régnier and so on, they came up, of course, with the simplest models. The GNP model is very famous. It says that I have n nodes, and P is the probability that any two nodes will be connected with an edge. And in that case, it's so simple that you can actually derive everything, anything you can imagine. You can derive the degree distribution, which you can approximate with the Poisson distribution. You can, of course, derive things like, the average degree, the variance of the degree distribution. And the interesting thing is that for those graphs, you can actually show that there is a phase transition, that as you are basically increasing the average degree, or equivalently, as you increase the probability P, the probability that you connect to nodes, there is a certain critical threshold where after this point, the graph, as we say, starts having a large connected component, a significant fraction of nodes that are actually connected, in the sense that you can go from any node in that set to any other node. So all of this is in some sense, old stuff, but I still feel the need to tell you, how the field evolved over the years. In those graphs, GNP graphs, you can derive things about the diameter of the graph, like what's the essentially largest, shortest path in the graph, what is the average shortest path length. And it's important here that for those graphs, this distance is basically scaled logarithmically with the size of the graph. So in case you have heard about this thing called the small world effect, right? It basically boils down to that this distance is how many hops you have to go from one node to another node. It's basically increasing very, very slowly, right? So even for very large graphs with millions or billions of nodes, like for instance, say if you have a social network on planet Earth, where about 7 billion people, based on measurements that people have done and based on analysis, the diameter of this social network would not be more than, about 6 hops, right? So you may have heard about this notion of that the real networks are small world networks. Then another important property about networks is that you don't have actually neutrality in terms of or independence in terms of the connections between nodes of different degrees. Instead, there is a strong bias sometimes, most of the time, either that nodes with large degree, they connect to other nodes with large degree, and nodes with small degree, they connect to other nodes with small degree. So these are called assortative networks. Or in some cases, you find the opposite, where nodes with large degree tend to connect with nodes with small degree, and of course the opposite. So in those cases, when you think about the topology and when you think about the connectivity of the graph, you should think about these conditional probabilities. Let's say, what's the probability basically that I will have a neighbor? What's the probability that a certain node will have a degree k prime, given that it's connected to a node of degree k, right? So there are these correlations now in the degrees. And basically, after you have a way to talk about this statistically, then you can define metrics, such as what I show here, to examine if a network is assortative or disassortative or neutral. Okay. So these are all very basic things just to get us started. Let's talk a little bit about network models. Now, first of all, why would you want to model graphs, right? There are many different answers to this question. You may want to have a model so that you can create many other graphs, right? The generative models in some sense. The model may allow you to explain what is happening in that network and how that network came to be. We can have a more, parsimonious description of the network if we have a good model, and so on. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, people were excited about models that were very simple in the sense of, maybe they had only one parameter or even maybe 2 parameters. And And with such models, of course, it is easier, to do math and to prove things. This was a very celebrated model called preferential attachment. It was basically saying that I can have a graph that is gradually getting larger and larger. I'm adding basically one node at a time. And every time I add a new node, the probability that I will connect to a certain node of the graph is proportional to the degree of that node, right? So the larger the degree is, the more likely it is that the new guy will connect to that, right? So this is what this formula is essentially saying. And for that very, very simple model, you could prove that the degree distribution actually is a power law. You see this case Q essentially as the denominator. And power law degree distributions, again, they were a very celebrated thing back then because similar things were observed in real networks. Then, if we want to have more realistic models that are closer to what we actually see in practice, of course, we need to have more parameters. And so another celebrated model and very much used in practice was the model of stochastic block matrices, essentially. And so you can think of this model as capturing that there are different communities, different clusters in your network, and you can represent them with like what you see over there, for instance, probability, right? Say 0.1, 0.9, sorry, that any node in this block connects to any other node in this block with probability 90%, right? But if you are a node in this portion, in these rows, you connect to these nodes or those nodes with a probability of 0.05%. So you can represent pretty large networks, again, probabilistically, and you can capture the fact that these networks may have clusters, right, communities. Now, let me skip. I will start skipping some things selectively. I want to talk a little bit about this model because it kind of takes us a step closer to machine learning and a step closer to where things are now, even though this is not, state of the art anymore. So imagine now that you want to model a network in which you have communities, but it's not only that. It's not only that you have communities. You can have a hierarchy of communities. You can have communities within communities. Right, so you can say, for example, that okay, this whole green thing is one community, but actually, if I zoom into that, I can identify that this big green is, more clustered compared to the connection with its light green, right? So I can have nested communities, right? So the model that we will discuss now is based on this notion of a hierarchy of communities. And it was a probabilistic model, but instead of having a single probability to describe the connection between any pair of nodes, we will now have an entire binary tree, right? Where the leaves of the tree represent the nodes. And all of these internal nodes, you can think of them as each of them, having a probability value. And that probability value is telling you, let's take this guy here, right? The probability that is represented here is telling you with what probability the nodes at the left subtree connect with the nodes at the right side. Okay, let me give you an example. Consider this very simple graph, right? So I have a tree, a binary tree with the leaves being these 6 nodes, A, B, C, D, E, F. And now, let's take this internal, right? The probability is 1. That means that A and B are certainly connected, right? According to this model. This one here means that the nodes at the left part, which are A, B, C, connect with the nodes at the right part, which is only D, with a probability of 1/3. right? So in this case, you can think of it now as follows. Imagine that I give you this graph. This graph may represent my measurement, right? My data, right? The inference problem is how I will compute this probability, is how I will compute also this binary tree so that it best captures the observed data, the observed graph. That's the inference. You can also think about it the other way, which is if you have this tree with these probabilities, now you can use this tree as a generative model to generate many, many different graphs, right? That may not necessarily be identical to this, but at least they will have some statistical similarity. Okay. So let me just say one more thing and then I will. So I want to make sure you understand here why this model can produce a hierarchy of communities, nested communities, right? Because at different levels in the tree, you capture how dense is the connectivity at the layers below that node. So I can have, here some strong connectivity between A, B, C, and D, which is weaker than the connectivity between, A, B, C, D, and E, F. Right? So I can have this hierarchy in the clustering process. Yeah, Panayota, you wanted to say something. No, I mean, the order doesn't matter. So basically, if you write the order differently, of course, you will have to construct a different tree, right? But if I give you this network, and imagine that I give you these nodes, right, in this particular order, then the question is twofold, right? First, if I give you the tree, suppose that I also give you the tree, right? How would you compute these probabilities in the intermediate nodes, the internal nodes? Of course, the second harder question is, what if I don't give you the tree? You have to find the optimal binary tree to model this network. So let me talk a little bit about how we do that in a statistically rigorous way. But first, I hope that it's clear what we're trying to do, right? So we are given a network, we want to model it using essentially a tree and a dendrogram, right, where the leaves are nodes, and all these intermediate nodes have a probability, PR, right? R is the name of the internal node. So let's first assume that I give you the tree, right? To make your life easier, I specify what the tree is, and I just ask you to compute these optimal probabilities. Then it's a pretty easy, actually, statistical estimation problem, because you just have to write the expression for the likelihood, right, of essentially your data, this particular graph that you observe, given this tree, right? So what is that likelihood? Let's pick one particular, internal node, R. So essentially, for that node, we have a certain probability PR that the nodes at the left connect with the nodes at the right? So if we have LR nodes at the left and RR nodes at the right, this product is the number of all possible edges I can have between left and right. And let's say that PR is the actual number of edges that I have, right? So I have basically this being the probability that I have this number of edges, right? And this being essentially the probability that I will not have the remaining edges between left and right. And so if I write this for, if I consider all nodes, not only node that, given that I assume dependency, I have to multiply all of these probabilities to get the likelihood, right? The likelihood function for this whole given tree. Now, following the principles of maximizing the likelihood function in order to compute the parameters of the model, in this case, which are the parameters, right? The parameters are only the PRs. Because remember, if I give you the tree, you know this LR and RR. You know the tree, right? You know how many nodes are to the left and right of every node. So the only thing you have to estimate is the PRs, right? Which you can do by maximizing that function. Very basic calculus. I basically, compute the derivative, I set it equal to zero. I get the obvious result, which is that these probabilities are essentially, the optimal probabilities are essentially what is the fraction of edges, right, for each of these nodes. What is the fraction of edges between the nodes at the left and the nodes at the right that actually exist in the data, right? So if I look at my data between A, B, C, and D, right, there is only one edge actually, and how many possible edges could exist between A, B, C, and D? 3, right? So that probability is 1/3 for that reason. So I can easily do that calculation if you give me the tree. But what happens if I don't know the tree? Well, then we don't really have kind of a mathematically, tractable way to tell you, okay, this is the optimal tree structure you should use. So people have used things like, Markov-Chain Monte Carlo methods, where essentially, you start exploring possible trees, and for each tree, given the tree, you're going to calculate the likelihood of that tree, how close that tree essentially agrees with your data, and then you navigate that space as we usually do with MCMC, basically not only moving in the direction of always increasing your likelihood, but also accepting with a small probability, right, steps that will take us to lower likelihood. And the kind of manipulations that we do in the tree is like, if you start, for example, from this tree, and we focus on this node R, the node will be chosen, it has the sub-3S, the sub-3D, right, left and right, and then everything else at the right side is represented here by the sub-3D. So the manipulations that I can do, I can basically move essentially, the node R so that the tree becomes like this, right? We can have T and U having a common ancestor rather than S and T. Or I can essentially swap U and T, right? So these are the manipulations I consider. Actually, both of them guarantee ergodicity. And through this numerical process, it's not a guarantee of some sort, but through this numerical process, I can construct basically binary trees that are very good in terms of fitting my data. So this is like, the reason I spent so much time on this model was because I wanted you to understand the notion of essentially models that are derived statistically from data using a statistically rigorous framework. And then if you have now this model, if you have this dendrogram with these probabilities, right, you can basically generate as many graphs as you want. And they will all kind of follow the same statistical properties with the given graph, the given data. Now, what happened so the previous model that I showed you, you can think of it as maybe 2000, what was it, like, 10, something like that, right? And then, of course, around 2013, the revolution of deep learning started, right? With these deep neural networks and so on. Initially, people were not using them for graphs. They were using them for other types of data. But then just a few years ago, people started using machine learning more and more on graphs. And I want to tell you a little bit about that. So I'm glad that Michalis gave the previous talk because he already gave you kind of a summary of machine learning. So basically in machine learning, it's very important, as you know, to represent everything with vectors, right? You have to have somehow a feature vector, a numerical representation of anything that you're modeling. And so in the case of graphs, of course, we can try to construct now a feature vector for every node. Now, how would you construct, what would be the features of a node, right? Think about it. Well, in a graph, the only thing that matters is the connectivity, who you connect with, right? So somehow these features have to take into account your neighborhood, either your direct connections or your local neighborhood, right? Of course, in some applications, the nodes may have additional features. For instance, if this is a social network, for every node, you may know if it's a man or a woman, you know, the age, and you may have these additional features that you also want to capture. But putting that aside, so essentially what we are trying to do in most of this exercise is, given a graph, to find somehow this encoder, right, that will represent every node with a vector that we typically refer to as the embedding vector. And so to kind of switch domains, go from the domain of a graph to a domain of this embedding space, the space of vectors, which is typically, you know, not only 2 dimensions, but multi-dimensional. So this is visualized here with a very simple graph, just in 2 dimensions. You know, the graphs, the nodes that are purple, you see that they are quite well connected. They are represented with points in this space that are close to each other, while the nodes that are very far from each other in terms of connectivity, let's say the purple and the, what is that now? I don't know. These nodes are represented in this space as far away, geometrically speaking, right? So this is kind of the intuition of embeddings. And you can find, you know, you can have easy embeddings, kind of simple embeddings or shallow embeddings, and you can have deep embeddings, right? So the shallow embeddings are based on little mathematical formulas you can write. For example, you can say 2 nodes, right? How similar they are, it depends on how many common neighbors they have. So if I have, you know, a node, the red node and the blue node, as you can see, they have a couple of nodes that are common neighbors, right? So in some sense, this tells us that these 2 nodes, the red and the blue, are close to each other, right? Graph-wise. And so you can quantify that with similarity metrics of different sorts. This one is basically saying Ki is the degree of node I, Kj is the degree of node J. So I'm normalizing here with the smallest degree. Nij is how many nodes, how many neighbors are common between I and J, right? So in this case, this would be 2. And this is whether the 2 nodes I and J are actually connected directly themselves, right? So this is one way to quantify similarity. There are many others. And if you have now the similarity metrics, you can do pretty standard machine learning stuff where you can write, for instance, a loss function, and you can say, okay, what I'm trying to do now is I want to compute embeddings, right, for every node, for node U, for node V. And so I will consider all possible pairs of nodes. And for each pair, I will try to minimize a certain norm of the dot product of the 2 embedding vectors, how close the 2 vectors are, right? I want to bring that as close as possible to the similarity that the 2 nodes have in terms of connectivity. So if the 2 nodes they have a lot of common neighbors, they are probably in the same cluster, right? This is large, I want this dot product to be large. And if this is small, I want this dot product to be small, right? And so I'm through some either typically, you know, through some numerical methods such as gradient descent, I try to minimize this function by computing these embeddings that actually will give you the lowest possible loss, right? Now, the more recent or more modern ways of doing these embeddings is not actually to compute similarity the way I showed you before, but to actually do small random walks. You may have heard about methods such as deep walk or node to vec, right? So what do these methods do? The idea is very simple. You start from every node and you do some random walks, right? You walk on the graph like a random person and you explore the local neighborhood of that node. So these random walks are typically a small number of steps, right? So you explore the local neighborhood, which is, we will represent it here as N of R of node U, the neighborhood of node U. It's actually a multi-set. It's not a set, right? Because you can visit the same node multiple times. And then essentially you parameterize, you have this probability that if I start from U and I do my random walk, what is the probability that I will end up to B, right? You parameterize this conditional probability with a standard softmax formula, and essentially you are then trying again, to minimize this loss function across all the nodes, considering all the neighborhoods of every node, trying essentially to compute the optimal embeddings, right? So this is pretty standard stuff for computing embeddings of graphs. Now, if you have, right, so we started from the graph, we went to the adjacency matrix, we went now to the embeddings, which essentially think about it as a different vector for every node. If you reach this point, right, from that point on, you can actually solve many, many different problems using just machine learning 101, right? Because now, for example, you can do classification on the graph. You can say, if I have some data and some nodes represent, healthy people, some nodes represent sick people, let me train my machine learning model to do this classification using these embeddings, right? I can forget that this is a graph. I can just work in the domain of the embeddings. And I can do things like predicting links. I can do anomaly detection in the graph and so on. Okay. I mean, I know that I started late, but I will try to. Padeli, are you the timekeeper?
Yeah.
Okay. I will try to finish in 10 minutes. Okay. So let me show you now a little bit about kind of deep embeddings, right? What I told you before was shallow embeddings. So how do you represent a graph with a neural network? The concept is very simple, but quite often, people get confused about it. Why do they get confused? Because the terminology is confusing. We will be using, the term network to talk about two things: the neural network and the network that we are trying to model. So to kind of make your life a little bit easier, I will use now the term network only for the neural network and the term graph for the network that we're trying to model, okay? So I'm given, let's say, this graph, right? It has these 6 nodes, here's the connectivity that you see. And I want to construct a neural network to model that graph, right? What does that mean, first of all? In the standard practice of neural networks, I will have some inputs, some hidden nodes in the middle, and some output nodes at the output. And my intermediate nodes, my hidden nodes, will basically, I will have one of them for every node, right? So I will have, say, this node here of the neural network for the node A of the graph. So this is, let's say, one layer of the neural network. But the input connections in that neural network from the previous layer, this is the previous layer, come only from nodes that represent neighbors of A. Right? So A in the graph is connected with B, C, and D. Right? So in my neural network, that hidden node that represents A in that specific layer receives input only from the hidden nodes that represent B, C, and D in the previous node. Right? And I can do this not only, of course, for node A, I can do it for every node. Right? So for every node, I can have a corresponding, what happens at this layer, at the previous layer, and of course, these are the inputs, right? So for every node that has an input, it may be just a random number, or it may be some features of that node. Remember, I was telling you that a node may also have some features that are independent of connectivity. Are you a man? Are you a woman? How old are you? So these are the input features, but then to compute embeddings for each node at the next layer, computing essentially receiving input only from the embeddings of the nodes at the previous layer that are connected in the graph. So the red node is B, I think, it connects only with the yellow and the green. Right? That's why you only see two connections. Okay, so mathematically speaking, I can show this as follows. So a little bit of terminology here. I will have SH representing an embedding, right? H of node B at layer K, right? So this is the embedding for that particular node of the graph at layer K. So what does that embedding depend on? It depends, first of all, on what was the embedding of that same node at the previous layer, right? Because you want to have this deep learning, right? Where in every layer you kind of revise your embeddings. So there is the embedding of the same node in the previous layer and a summation essentially of these embeddings from all your neighbors. These are your neighbors, not neighbors of node B, at the previous layer, right? The embeddings of those neighbors at the previous layer. And of course, in the standard practice of neural networks, you have your parameters, right, which you can represent with matrices. We use here two different matrices, the W and the P. The P are parameters that we use to capture the dependence of the same node from the previous layer. W is to capture the dependence of that node from the neighbors in the previous layer. And of course, all of this cannot be linear. We have to take it through a nonlinearity that function sigma. Think of it as ReLU or whatever else you are using. So this is the mathematical expression that represents essentially what happens in the forward path, going from one layer to the next. And it's important to understand that we're sharing parameters here. We're not modeling what happens to every node separately, right? We use the same matrices W and B for all the nodes in that layer. If we were not doing that, we would have really poor generalization abilities because we would only model what happens to the connectivity of a specific node. So by capturing, I thought I silenced my phone, but I didn't. So by capturing this, by having this matrices common across all of the nodes per layer, I can actually generalize, right, across nodes that maybe I haven't really used in my training data. And of course, after I have these embeddings, right, I mean, I of course, I will be doing this for a certain number of layers. Okay, when do I stop? After a certain number of layers, I will have my final embeddings, right? Then I can use those embeddings in my decoder, right, where I compute actually, the output of the network. So if the purpose of my network is to do binary classification, let's say a node, is it healthy or is it sick, right? You can think of it as this variable here, binary variable. Is this 1 or is it 0, right? Healthy or sick. And then I can have basically this representing the embeddings of each node at the final layer, right? I have my parameters D here, which represent the decoder. I have to learn these parameters from data. And this is very standard. This function that you see here is the very standard cross entropy loss, right? Which I'm trying basically to minimize. I'm computing essentially these parameters, D, the parameters of the decoder, to minimize that function so that I can do my classification as well as possible, right? So if I give you, the key point here is that if I give you some training data, let's go back to this example, and I tell you, for instance, that, you know, the nodes T, F, B are healthy, the rest of the nodes are either, you know, let's say I tell you B, A, and B are healthy, E, F are sick, and for C, I don't know what it is. I want you to classify what that node is using this neural network, right? So in that case, you can use basically this decoder. You can train it based on the training data I gave you, which nodes are healthy, which nodes are sick, and then you can use this decoder, the trained one, to classify the nodes for which you don't know if they're healthy or sick, right? Okay, for this one, because I ran out of time and I don't want to kind of like make it too late, I will just tell you what the problem is. Think of it as an application, and I will not tell you so much about how they actually solve it. So imagine a situation. This is a very real problem that, you know, the issue is that every medicine has side effects. You know that. But the problem is that when you combine medicine, you can have side effects that are not known from each individual medicine. So you take this antibiotic, you have the side effects. You take this, you know, painkiller or something, you have some other side effects. When you combine the two medicines, you may get side effects that are actually specific to that combination. So you can model this type of thing with a very interesting graph where, but let me just explain this graph and then I'll think. What happens in this graph is that you have nodes of different types. You have the green nodes that represent medicines, right? This is an antibiotic and so on. The edges between nodes represent side effects when you combine those two medicines, right? So R2, I think, is, you know, bradycardia. Additionally, in your graph, every node has a feature vector. These are things that are specific for that medicine, independent of any networks, right? And in your graph, you are also modeling basically proteins or the corresponding genes, proteins that bind to that, or actually the other way. The medicine binds to these proteins, right? So we also know a little bit about the underlying biology. This medicine actually binds, you know, say, to these 24 proteins and the corresponding genes. So why is this very important? You may not know which are the side effects that you will have if you take this medicine together with this new medicine that maybe has not been tested, right? So just by having this graph, you want to predict what kind of edge we have here. Will it be R1, R2, something else? How can we make this inference? If you have data for the rest of the network, right? You can learn from this network, for instance, that typically what happens when a medicine, you know, binds to this protein, and when you have two medicines, for instance, that bind to this protein, you tend to have a certain side effect, right? That's the simplest example you can have. But you can have much more complex things where the specific type of side effect we have between the medicines depends not only on one gene, but on a number of different genes, right? And they may be specific to different combinations of drugs. So I will only tell you that people have actually used graph neural networks to solve this problem in the sense of predicting new side effects that were not known in the literature, and then they were experimentally validated, which was a big success. And it was all done using this technology of graph neural networks I was showing you before. So I'm not going to tell you anything about that. Another thing that unfortunately we don't have time to cover is you can also use these deep graph neural networks as generator models to basically produce graphs that agree with your data. And, oh, now I probably have destroyed the, okay, forget it. I wanted to jump to my last slide, in which I wanted to tell you that there are also some very interesting research areas in this field that are now emerging, right? Things that will become probably more popular in the next few years, but I ran out of time, so I will stop here. Padeli, do we have any time for questions, or?
Let's have a couple of questions and we can have a coffee break. We actually have
Okay.
one from the online participants. Does the speaker thinks that the use of graph theory in brain MRIs in order to detect diseases is possible?
It's a long, I mean, a good answer should be a long answer. There has been a lot of controversy in the sense that initially, as it usually happens in science, there was a lot of enthusiasm and people published a lot of papers saying that we can use this type of tools to, diagnose all kinds of diseases, schizophrenia and Parkinson's and this and that. Then the domain experts looked at those things more carefully. They had a lot of criticism, a lot of pushback. I think now we're kind of at the stage where this area becomes more mature and we can separate the false claims from the, true claims.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
Yorgo.
So when I saw the adjacency matrix of a graph, why don't we just use convolutional filters to learn the relationships between nodes?
Right. So people also do that. I mean, I talked about the most basic type of graph neural network, which kind of resembles MLPs, multi-layer perceptrons in some sense. But in the same way you have convolutional neural networks, you also have graph convolutional neural networks, right? That are based on what you said, basically. There are many, many different types of graph neural networks these days. It's a zoo.
Just curious for the stochastic block model, people tried adapting the size of the block because the clusters could have different sizes. Wasn't sure.
Right. So to parameterize that model, right, you will need to tell me how big is your network, how big will be your overall matrix, right? You need to tell me how many clusters you want, how big its cluster will be, what's the probability of connection within its cluster, what's the probability of connection between that cluster and the rest of the nodes. You still have to parameterize, you have to specify all of these things, right? So it's not a model that is only one parameter. It's, but it's not as many parameters as a typical machine learning model, which can be, thousands or millions of parameters.
But the block size there was fixed. Once you fix it, it's only one size. If I'm correctly, or can you?
I mean, it depends, right? You can have basically, if you are only trying to generate networks of a certain size, then those parameters would be fixed, right? But if I say I want to generate graphs of different sizes, right, then I can specify those parameters in more relative terms. Instead of saying that the cluster is 100 nodes, I can say that cluster 1 is 10% of the nodes. Then I can create networks of arbitrary sizes, right?
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very
Question,
much.
please?
So we have a break now?
Yeah, we'll have a coffee break. Let's say, sorry, it's gonna be tight and short, 20 minutes, and come back at 10 to 12.
Okay.
There's coffee and snacks outside for everybody. Thank you.
So, I mean, are we kind of like reducing the amount of time we're late or we keep it, we're reducing it gradually?
Επειδή το πρωί μέχρι τις 9 γίνεται δεύτερο κόσμος,
Ναι. Γιατί είναι κάπως έτσι λιγότερη αυτό, ας πούμε.
έχουμε και μερικούς online, αλλά
Okay. Πάντα έτσι είναι κάτι έτσι.
στα χρόνια δεν
Ναι, ναι, γιατί. Αυτό είναι το λιγότερο.